In 1855, in the depths of an isolated plantation in the interior of South Carolina, a photograph was taken. The image, discovered only in 2019 in a sealed trunk in county court archives, shows a young white woman of corpulent appearance standing beside an impeccably dressed black man. On the back of the photograph, an inscription faded by time revealed only fragments. Sealed contract, necessity of the house, absolute silence. For decades, local historians attempted to decipher the meaning of that disturbing image. Who were these people? Why was the photograph hidden in sealed court files? And why did families descended from Colonel Edward Whitmore refuse to speak about Martha Whitmore, the eldest daughter who simply vanished from family records after 1855? The truth emerging from the archives is darker than any Southern Gothic fiction. Martha Whitmore, rejected by 30 suitors from the most distinguished families in the region due to her appearance and difficult temperament, became the center of a macabre pact orchestrated by her own father, a pact that involved coercion, falsified documents, and a complicit silence that lasted more than 160 years. The man in the photograph was not a free servant. He was Samuel, an enslaved man owned by Colonel Whitmore, forced to participate in an arrangement that violated every social and moral law of the era. What happened inside that colonial mansion, far from the eyes of Southern society, remained buried until encrypted letters and legal documents revealed the extent of the horror. This is the story of Martha Whitmore, of Samuel, and of the secret that an entire family conspired to erase from history. This is the story of how slavery not only destroyed bodies, but also created moral monsters among those who perpetuated it. Chapter 1. The Forgotten Photograph. 170 years ago, in an isolated plantation in the heart of South Carolina, court documents and private correspondence mentioned a case so disturbing that it ended up buried in silence. Martha Whitmore, daughter of Colonel Edward Whitmore, disappeared from official records after 1855, but not from the oral memory of the local black community. The absence left deep scars, marking generations with a silent trauma that is only now beginning to be revealed. Before we continue, subscribe and activate the bell. Here we unearth secrets buried by official history and give voice to what has been silenced. The discovery happened in March 2019, when the restoration of the old Beaufort County Courthouse exposed an iron safe hidden behind a wooden panel. Inside, among deteriorated documents and forgotten cases, was a mahogany box sealed with red wax. The seal belonged to the Whitmore family, one of the most powerful cotton planter dynasties in pre-war South Carolina. When archivists finally opened the box, they found 17 letters, 3 legal documents, and a single daguerreotype photograph. The image was unsettling in its formal composition. A young white woman, visibly corpulent, dressed in elaborate Victorian attire, sat rigidly in an ornate chair. Beside her, standing with a strangely dignified posture, was a black man of approximately 30 years, dressed in fine clothes that seemed completely out of context for the era. The woman's expression was one of bitter resignation, the man's of absolute emptiness. On the back of the photograph, written in faded ink, it read, Martha E. Whitmore and Samuel, contract sealed according to agreement of June 12, 1855, necessity of the house, absolute silence according to testamentary clause. Historian Dr. Rebecca Thornton, specialist in the history of slavery in the South, was called to examine the material. Her first impression upon seeing the photograph was one of profound discomfort. Photographs of enslaved people beside their owners were not uncommon, she explained in a later interview, but the composition of this image was different. There was something ritualistic, almost matrimonial, in the way they were positioned. The letters revealed an even more disturbing narrative. Correspondence between Colonel Whitmore and lawyers in Charleston openly discussed the Martha problem and the need for a permanent domestic solution that would preserve the family's honor. Martha Whitmore had been born in 1830, the firstborn of Edward and Catherine Whitmore. From an early age, medical records and family letters indicated that the young woman suffered from a condition that doctors of the era called melancholic constitution and uncontrollable appetite. By age 25, Martha weighed significantly more than women of her social class, a characteristic that, in Southern society obsessed with appearances, became a mark of shame. Between 1850 and 1854, Colonel Whitmore arranged meetings with 30 potential suitors. All rejected Martha, some openly, others through diplomatic refusals mediated by lawyers. The preserved letters reveal the colonel's growing desperation and the public humiliation the family faced. My daughter has become an object of mockery in the halls of Charleston, Whitmore wrote in a letter to a cousin in 1854. No gentleman of good lineage will accept her hand. Mothers steer their sons away as if Martha carried plague. The Whitmore name is being tarnished by this situation. But it was the last letter, dated May 1855, that revealed the fateful decision. Written in coded language, Whitmore discussed with a trusted lawyer an unprecedented domestic solution that would guarantee offspring and resolve the inheritance question without public scandal. The plan was in motion, and Samuel, an enslaved man who worked as a specialized carpenter on the property, had been chosen. No one asked his opinion. No one considered his consent. Samuel was property, and property has no voice. The photograph was taken 1 month later, on the day fraudulent documents were signed in the presence of witnesses paid to maintain silence. What would happen inside that colonial mansion in the following years would remain hidden for more than 160 years, buried under layers of lies, burned documents, and institutionalized terror. But truth, like bones in dry wells, always finds a way to emerge. Chapter 2. The Whitmore House and Its Secrets. The Whitmore property extended over more than 2,000 acres along the Ashley River, one of the most productive cotton plantations in South Carolina in the years before the Civil War. The main mansion, a 3-story neoclassical structure with Corinthian columns, dominated the landscape like a monument to wealth extracted from forced labor. More than 200 enslaved people worked on Whitmore lands, in the cotton fields under the scorching sun, in the processing workshops, in the stables, and of course inside the big house itself, where a cruel hierarchy separated the domestics from the field workers. Samuel belonged to a rare category. An exceptional carpenter, he had been trained by a German artisan hired by Colonel Whitmore years before. Samuel built furniture, repaired structures, and created decorative pieces that rivaled the work of free men. His skill guaranteed him certain freedoms within the slavery system, cruel permissions that were, in reality, invisible chains. He lived in a separate cabin, not in the common quarters where dozens of enslaved people crowded together in deplorable conditions. He received better clothes, slightly superior food, small crumbs of humanity that only served to make his prison more sophisticated. Oral accounts preserved by descendants of the local black community paint Samuel as a man of silent dignity. Tall, with features suggesting West African ancestry, he rarely spoke beyond what was necessary. On Saturday nights, when the enslaved gathered for spiritual songs and stolen moments of community, Samuel remained apart, working on his wooden pieces by candlelight. My great-grandfather used to say that Samuel was a man marked by sadness even before 1855, recounted James Washington, direct descendant of people enslaved on the Whitmore property, in an interview recorded for the County Oral History Project. He had lost a wife and 2 children sold to plantations in Mississippi years before. His pain was too deep for words. Martha Whitmore, meanwhile, lived an equally isolated existence inside the mansion. Letters from relatives and visitors describe a young woman of explosive temperament, subject to episodes of profound melancholy intercalated with periods of uncontrollable rage. Doctors of the era attributed her behavior to female hysteria and imbalances of the humors, prescribing bloodletting and laudanum-based tonics. The reality was more complex. Martha was trapped in a body that society considered unacceptable, in a family obsessed with appearances, in an era that offered women no form of autonomy. Each suitor who rejected her deepened her public humiliation. Each whisper in Charleston halls about the colonel's fat daughter was a new wound to her already destroyed dignity. In the winter of 1854, after the 30th rejection, Martha attempted suicide by ingesting a massive dose of laudanum. She was saved by one of the enslaved women who worked as personal maids, a woman named Esther whose testimony, decades later, would be crucial to reconstructing the events. The incident was covered up. Doctors were paid for silence. The family spread rumors of a passing illness that had affected Martha, but Colonel Whitmore understood that time was running out. His daughter was 24 years old, considered practically unmarriageable by the standards of the era. Without a legitimate marriage, the Whitmore lineage faced a crisis of succession and social prestige. It was then that the colonel conceived what he himself, in a sealed letter to his lawyer, called a solution without precedent in the annals of Southern civilization. The plan was simple in its cruelty and complex in its execution. Samuel would be forced into an arrangement with Martha that would produce heirs carrying Whitmore blood. The children, being visibly of mixed race, could never be acknowledged publicly, but legal documents would be created to guarantee them a portion of inheritance through complex trusts and falsified records. Samuel had no choice. Refusal meant death, torture, or sale to the brutal sugar plantations of Louisiana, where the average life expectancy of an enslaved person was 7 years. Acceptance meant a different kind of death, a violation of body and spirit that would be repeated until Martha produced the desired offspring. The legal documents discovered in 2019 reveal the extent of the conspiracy. 3 Charleston lawyers, 2 judges, and a notary public participated in creating a parallel system of inheritance that would function invisibly alongside official Whitmore records. Witnesses were paid substantial sums, their silence guaranteed through both money and threats. On June 12, 1855, in a private ceremony witnessed only by these complicit parties, documents were signed. Samuel's signature appears at the bottom of the page, a shaky X that represents not consent, but surrender. Martha's signature is firm, written with the anger of someone who understands she too is a prisoner of circumstances beyond her control. The photograph was taken immediately after. It would be the only visual record of what was, in essence, a ritualized rape, sanctioned by legal documents and social power. That night, Samuel was moved from his separate cabin to a room in the servants' quarters of the main house, a room with a lock that could only be opened from the outside. Martha was told by her father that she finally had a companion who would fulfill the duties that no gentleman wished to assume. Neither of them spoke during that first night. According to Esther's later testimony, the sounds that came from that room were of weeping from both. The true horror was only beginning. Chapter 3. The Sealed Years. The years between 1855 and 1861 exist in Whitmore family records as a void. No social events are mentioned. No visitors are recorded. The family that once hosted elaborate balls and received the cream of Charleston society retreated into complete isolation. Letters from concerned relatives asking about Martha's well-being went unanswered. Invitations to weddings, baptisms, and social gatherings were declined with vague references to health complications and family matters requiring privacy. The enslaved community on the property, however, knew exactly what was happening inside the main house. Esther, who worked as Martha's personal maid, witnessed the daily reality of the arrangement. Her testimony, recorded in 1923 when she was 91 years old and living in Philadelphia, provides the most detailed account of those sealed years. Miss Martha was not a cruel woman by nature, Esther recalled, her voice preserved in one of the earliest audio recordings of formerly enslaved people's testimonies. She was a broken woman, turned cruel by her circumstances. She hated Samuel for what he represented, even though she knew he had no more choice than she did. Now I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching us from and the exact time you are listening to this story. I want to know how far these silenced accounts reach. Samuel was kept in a state of complete control. He was not allowed to leave the main house without escort. His carpentry work ceased entirely. His existence was reduced to serving Martha's needs and enduring her volatile moods that swung between desperate loneliness and vindictive cruelty. Sometimes she would talk to him like he was human, Esther continued, asking about his life before, about the wife and children he'd lost. Other times she would scream at him, call him things I won't repeat, blame him for the situation they were both trapped in. The psychological torture was matched by physical isolation. Samuel was forbidden from interacting with other enslaved people on the property. Meals were brought to him separately. On Sundays, when the enslaved community gathered for worship and the brief respite it provided, Samuel remained locked in his room. The community tried to maintain connection. Workers would deliberately pass by the windows of Samuel's room, singing spirituals that carried coded messages of solidarity. Women doing laundry would position themselves where Samuel might see them from his window, offering silent acknowledgement of his existence. But the isolation achieved its purpose. By late 1855, according to Esther's account, Samuel had stopped speaking almost entirely. He moved through his imprisonment like a ghost, performing the functions required of him, but retreating into an internal space where his captors could not follow. In March 1856, Martha became pregnant. The news was not celebrated. Colonel Whitmore summoned his lawyers immediately. New documents were prepared, complex legal arrangements that would hide the child's paternity while ensuring inheritance rights through deliberately obscure trusts and provisions. Dr. Harrison Fletcher, the family physician sworn to silence through both payment and threat, attended to Martha throughout her pregnancy. His private journals, discovered in 2015, reveal his own moral struggle with what he was witnessing. "I am complicit in an abomination," he wrote in September 1856. The young woman suffers not just the physical burden of pregnancy, but the psychological torment of her situation. The man kept for this purpose displays signs of complete psychological dissolution. "I have prescribed tonics for Martha's nerves and sleeping draughts for the man, but no medicine can address the fundamental evil of this arrangement." The pregnancy was difficult. Martha's weight, combined with the medical understanding of the era, created genuine health risks. She was confined to bed for the final 3 months, attended constantly by Esther and 2 other enslaved women sworn to absolute silence about everything they witnessed. Samuel was brought to her room daily. Sometimes she would demand his presence simply to have someone to rage against. Other times, in moments of vulnerability that terrified her, she would speak to him almost as an equal, discussing her fears about childbirth and motherhood. She knew she was creating a child who would never be fully hers, Esther recalled. A child who would carry the stain of this arrangement forever. "I think that's what broke her most, not the situation itself, but what it was creating." On December 3, 1856, Martha gave birth to a daughter. The child was visibly of mixed race with features that made her parentage undeniable. She was named Catherine after Martha's deceased mother, but no birth certificate was ever filed with county authorities. Colonel Whitmore looked at his granddaughter once and left the room. He never acknowledged her existence again. The birth should have ended the arrangement. The colonel had his heir, however complicated, but slavery, once invoked as a solution, reveals its true nature. Power, once assumed absolute, expands to fill every available space. Samuel was not released. Instead, the colonel determined that 1 child was insufficient. Martha, despite her physical and emotional exhaustion, was expected to produce at least 1 more heir. To ensure the line, as the colonel put it in correspondence with his lawyers. The arrangement continued. Chapter 4. The Children of Silence. Between 1856 and 1860, Martha gave birth to 3 more children. A son in 1858 named Edward after the colonel. Twin girls in 1860 named Margaret and Elizabeth. All 4 children were visibly of mixed race. All 4 existed in a legal and social limbo, created by their grandfather's machinations. The children were not raised as Whitmore heirs, despite the legal documents that theoretically guaranteed them inheritance rights. They were not raised as enslaved children either, though their father's status as property made their own freedom questionable at best. Instead, they existed in a strange middle space, confined to specific areas of the main house, cared for by enslaved women who understood they were witnessing something unprecedented and deeply wrong. Esther became the primary caretaker for all 4 children. Her testimony provides glimpses into their early years. "They were beautiful children," she recalled, "but sad. Even the babies seemed to carry sadness in their eyes. They knew somehow that they didn't belong anywhere." Martha's relationship with her children was complicated and painful. She loved them, Esther insisted, but that love was tangled with resentment, shame, and the ongoing trauma of how they came to exist. She would hold them and cry, Esther said, then push them away and refuse to see them for days. Samuel's relationship with his children was even more fraught. He was their father, but he had no rights over them. He could not protect them, make decisions about their upbringing, or even spend time with them without permission. The children were taught to call him by his first name, never father. He would watch them from doorways, Esther remembered, just watching, with this look of such pain on his face. The oldest girl, Catherine, she somehow knew. When she was maybe 3 years old, she started going to him, holding his hand. Miss Martha would scream when she saw it, pull Catherine away. But the child kept trying. The psychological damage to all parties was profound and escalating. Martha's mental health, already fragile, deteriorated further. She experienced periods of what Dr. Fletcher's journals describe as complete psychological collapse, during which she would not eat, speak, or leave her bed for weeks at a time. Samuel, according to multiple accounts, attempted suicide in 1859 by hanging himself from a beam in his room. He was found by one of the enslaved men who worked in the house and was revived. The colonel's response was not concern, but anger. Samuel was beaten severely and placed under constant surveillance. The children, growing older, began to understand their situation. Catherine, the eldest, started asking questions by age 4. Why didn't she have a real name like other children? Why couldn't she leave the house? Why did grandfather look away when she entered a room? No one could provide answers that made sense to a child's mind. The enslaved community on the property watched this horror unfold with a mixture of sympathy and helplessness. They could do nothing to intervene without risking their own lives, but they bore witness, and they remembered. "We all knew," said James Washington, whose great-grandfather worked in the Whitmore stables. "The whole community knew. We would pray for those children, pray for Samuel, even pray for Miss Martha. It was an evil thing, and we were all trapped in it together." Colonel Whitmore, meanwhile, proceeded with his legal arrangements. The 4 children were designated in secret trust documents as beneficiaries of portions of the Whitmore estate. But the documents were structured so that these inheritances could only be claimed under specific, nearly impossible conditions. The children would need to prove their identity without ever being able to acknowledge their true parentage publicly. They would need to navigate legal systems that did not recognize them as fully human. They would need to do all this after the colonel's death, when the white Whitmore family would have every incentive to deny their claims. It was a legal fiction designed to appear generous while ensuring the children would never actually receive anything. It was another layer of cruelty in a situation built entirely on cruelty. By 1860, the arrangement had lasted 5 years. Samuel was 35 years old and looked 50. Martha was 30 years old and existed in a state of near-constant psychological crisis. The 4 children were growing up in isolation, denied normal childhood, denied identity, denied future. And then, in April 1861, the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter. The Civil War began, and with it came chaos that would both worsen and eventually complicate the Whitmore family's terrible secret. Chapter 5. War and Dissolution. The Civil War reached South Carolina with particular intensity. The state that had led the secession movement found itself at the center of a conflict that would ultimately destroy the entire social system upon which families like the Whitmores had built their power. Colonel Edward Whitmore, too old for military service at 62, nevertheless threw his considerable resources behind the Confederate cause. Wagons of cotton were sent to support the war effort. Enslaved men from the property were impressed into service-building fortifications around Charleston. The colonel's younger brother and 3 nephews joined Confederate regiments. But the main house remained sealed, its dark secret intact. The war actually served the colonel's purposes in one respect. It provided perfect cover for continued isolation. With men away fighting and resources scarce, no one questioned why the Whitmore plantation had withdrawn from social life entirely. The absence of balls and gatherings seemed patriotic sacrifice rather than suspicious behavior. Inside the house, however, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Martha's mental state had declined to the point where Dr. Fletcher in his journals expressed serious concern for her survival. "She speaks increasingly of death as a release," he wrote in May 1862. "The burdens she carries have exceeded the capacity of her mind to bear them." Samuel had become completely silent. Esther's testimony indicates he went months without speaking a single word. "He was there in body," she said, "but his spirit had gone somewhere else. Somewhere we couldn't reach him." The children, now ranging from age 2 to 6, were becoming more aware and more questioning. Catherine, the eldest, was particularly observant. She had begun to understand that other children in the world had different lives, freedoms she could not comprehend but somehow recognized she was denied. Then, in November 1862, Colonel Whitmore suffered a massive stroke. He survived but was left partially paralyzed and unable to speak clearly. The iron control he had maintained over the household cracked. Martha, freed partially from her father's dominating presence, made a decision that surprised everyone. She began taking the children outside the main house, not off the property, but into the gardens where they could feel sunlight and breathe air that didn't smell of confinement and secrets. It was during one of these outings that Catherine saw her father, Samuel, working in the carpentry shop that he'd been allowed to return to as the war created labor shortages. The child ran to him immediately, throwing her arms around his legs. Martha didn't pull her away this time. Instead, she stood watching, and according to Esther, who witnessed the scene, tears streamed down Martha's face as she watched her daughter embrace the man she'd been forced to use and had, in some twisted way, come to depend upon. "I think that was the moment Miss Martha realized the full extent of what had been done," Esther recalled. "Not just to Samuel, not just to herself, but to these innocent children who never asked to be born into this nightmare." The war intensified. By 1863, Union forces were advancing into South Carolina. Enslaved people on neighboring plantations were escaping in increasing numbers, making their way to Union lines where freedom awaited. The Whitmore plantation lost over 50 people to escape attempts in 1863 alone. Samuel had multiple opportunities to escape. Other enslaved men urged him to flee with them, but he refused every time, and the reason was simple: he could not leave his children behind. The legal documents designated them as potential heirs, not as free persons. If Samuel fled, the children would remain in indefinite limbo, neither enslaved nor free, with no one to advocate for them. It was the final, cruelest twist of the arrangement. Samuel's paternal feelings, the humanity that slavery tried to deny him, became the very chains that kept him imprisoned. By early 1865, Confederate defeat was imminent. Sherman's march to the sea had devastated Georgia. Union forces were approaching South Carolina's interior. The world the Whitmores had known was collapsing. Colonel Whitmore died in March 1865, 2 weeks before Lee's surrender at Appomattox. His final months had been spent in furious, incomprehensible attempts to communicate, his stroke-damaged brain apparently desperate to convey something crucial about the arrangements he'd made. His death freed no one. The legal documents he'd created existed in sealed trusts that wouldn't be accessible for years. The children remained in legal limbo. Samuel remained, technically, enslaved property of the Whitmore estate, and Martha, at 35 years old, found herself suddenly in control of a collapsing empire built on evil. What she did next would determine whether any justice could emerge from the horror. Chapter 6. Emancipation and Aftermath. The official end of slavery came to South Carolina in stages. The Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 had applied only to Confederate-held territories. True freedom arrived with Union occupation and the ratification of the 13th Amendment in December 1865. For the formerly enslaved people on the Whitmore plantation, the news was received with joy, terror, and uncertainty. Freedom was real, but freedom without resources, without land, without protection in a society that remained hostile, was a complicated gift. If this story has already captured your attention, leave a like. It helps Martha and Samuel's story reach more people. Most of the formerly enslaved population left the Whitmore property within weeks of emancipation. They headed to Charleston, to Union-controlled areas, seeking family members sold away years before, searching for new lives beyond the landscape of their trauma. Esther remained, primarily because of her attachment to the 4 children she'd helped raise. James Washington's great-grandfather also stayed temporarily, working for wages instead of under the whip, trying to save enough money to relocate his family to Philadelphia. Samuel faced an impossible choice. Freedom was his legally, but his children's status remained murky. The trust documents created by Colonel Whitmore designated them as beneficiaries but did not explicitly grant them freedom or acknowledge their full legal personhood. Martha was the one who made the decision that would define the rest of their lives. In June 1865, Martha Whitmore met with Union military authorities and lawyers in Charleston. She brought with her the sealed documents from her father's safe, all the letters and legal arrangements that proved what had been done. Her confession was complete and devastating. She acknowledged the forced nature of the arrangement, the legal conspiracies, the falsified records. She requested that the Union authorities recognize her 4 children as free persons entitled to inheritance from the Whitmore estate. The reaction from Union officials was complex. Slavery was ended, but cases involving white women and black men remained socially explosive even in the North. The idea that a white woman had been forced into such an arrangement generated sympathy, but that same sympathy often failed to extend to the black man who had been equally violated. Several lawyers suggested that Martha's confession would destroy any inheritance claims her children might have. If she acknowledged publicly that the children resulted from coercion rather than legitimate marriage, Southern courts, even under Union control, might rule them as illegitimate and therefore without inheritance rights. Martha faced the choice: protect her children's potential inheritance by maintaining the legal fiction, or tell the complete truth and potentially leave them with nothing. She chose truth. "I will not compound the evil my father created by continuing his lies," she stated in sworn testimony preserved in Union military records. "These children exist because of an abomination, but they are innocent, and they deserve to know their full truth, whatever the cost." The confession created a scandal that spread throughout Reconstruction-era South Carolina. The Whitmore name, already associated with slavery and rebellion, became synonymous with deeper depravity. Distant relatives who might have supported Martha's children instead disavowed the entire family. Samuel, for the first time since 1855, spoke publicly. His testimony to Union authorities, recorded by a military clerk, is brief but powerful. "I never wanted any of this. I wanted to live as a man, to love freely, to raise children in freedom. That was stolen from me. But the children are innocent. They should not suffer for what was done to their mother and me. If there is justice in this new world you promise, let it begin with protecting them." The legal battle over the Whitmore estate would continue for decades. White relatives challenged every claim. Southern lawyers exploited every technicality. The trust documents created by Colonel Whitmore proved to be exactly as difficult to navigate as he'd intended. But Martha fought for her children with a determination that Esther described as the only truly noble thing I saw her do. She sold off portions of the plantation to fund legal battles. She testified repeatedly, enduring public humiliation and social ostracism, to establish her children's rights. Samuel remained in South Carolina, working as a carpenter in Charleston. He was finally legally free, but the psychological scars of those 10 years of imprisonment never healed. Esther's testimony indicates he suffered from what we would now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress, experiencing nightmares and periods of deep depression until his death in 1879 at age 54. His relationship with his children was never simple or fully healed. The oldest, Catherine, sought him out regularly, and they developed a relationship built on shared trauma and tentative love. The younger children, especially the twins born in 1860, struggled to connect with a father they'd been taught to see as something other than fully human for their earliest years. Martha lived until 1889, dying at age 59. She never remarried, never had other children, never fully recovered from the psychological damage of her youth and the horrific arrangement her father had forced upon her. But she never stopped fighting for her children's rights. The final legal victory came in 1887, when the 4 children were granted partial inheritance rights to the Whitmore estate. It was a fraction of what should have been theirs, but it was enough to provide education and opportunities denied to most formerly enslaved people and their children. Chapter 7. The Descendants Speak. The story of Martha Whitmore and Samuel might have been lost entirely if not for the determination of their descendants and the broader black community that preserved the memory through oral tradition. Catherine Whitmore, the eldest child, lived until 1928. In her final years living in Philadelphia with her own children and grandchildren, she gave extensive interviews to early civil rights researchers and historians, documenting the era of slavery and its aftermath. Her account provides the most direct testimony of what it was like to grow up as a child of that arrangement. "We were ghosts," she said in a 1925 interview, "not quite enslaved, not quite free, not quite white, not quite black. We belonged nowhere, and everywhere we went people looked at us like we were evidence of something shameful." Catherine received enough education, thanks to Martha's efforts, to become a teacher. She dedicated her life to educating formerly enslaved children and their descendants, seeing it as a way to honor her father's stolen potential and her mother's eventual redemption. Her brother Edward, born in 1858, had a more difficult life. He struggled with mental health issues that family members attributed to the traumatic circumstances of his early childhood. He worked various manual labor jobs and died young, in 1891, at age 33. The twins, Margaret and Elizabeth, were the most successful of the 4 children in conventional terms. They received portions of the Whitmore inheritance that allowed them to purchase property in Charleston. They married into prominent black families in the city's post-war community and became active in the early civil rights movement of the late 19th century. But all 4 children carried psychological scars. All 4 struggled with questions of identity that had no easy answers in a society strictly divided by race and increasingly enforcing those divisions through Jim Crow laws. "My mother told me she never felt she belonged anywhere," recalled Margaret's daughter, interviewed in 1954 for a documentary project. "Too black for the white world, too white for the black world, and carrying a history too complicated and painful to explain to anyone." The broader black community that had been enslaved on the Whitmore plantation preserved detailed oral histories of Samuel and the arrangement. These accounts, passed down through generations, were crucial when historians began researching the case after the 2019 discovery of the sealed documents. James Washington, whose great-grandfather worked alongside Samuel, became a key source. His family had maintained oral traditions about the Whitmore plantation for more than 150 years. "We never forgot," he said. "Stories like that, they don't fade. They're too important to forget." The White Whitmore descendants, by contrast, maintained complete silence about Martha and her children. Family genealogies simply omitted Martha after 1855, listing her as died young, or providing no information at all. Questions about the 4 children were met with anger or denial. It took until 2019, when the sealed courthouse documents were discovered, for the White Whitmore family to be forced to acknowledge what had happened. Even then, many descendants refused to comment or insisted the documents were somehow falsified, but the evidence was overwhelming. Letters in Colonel Whitmore's hand, legal documents signed by known lawyers and judges, medical records from Dr. Fletcher's journals, testimony from multiple sources all corroborating the same basic facts, and most powerfully, the testimony of the descendants themselves, who had kept the story alive through oral tradition for more than 160 years, waiting for official history to finally acknowledge what they had always known. Chapter 8. Legal and Historical Reckoning. The discovery of the sealed Whitmore documents in 2019 created immediate legal and historical complications. The trust documents that Colonel Whitmore had created were theoretically still active, as some of the complex provisions extended for multiple generations. Descendants of the 4 children, now numbering in the hundreds spread across the United States, began consulting with lawyers about potential claims against the remaining Whitmore estate. Though most of the property had been sold or lost over the decades, certain parcels and assets remained under the control of White Whitmore descendants. The legal battles of the 2020s eerily echoed those of the 1860s-1880s. White Whitmore descendants argued that the statute of limitations had long expired on any claims. They claimed the trust documents were illegitimate products of coercion and should not be honored. They employed technical legal arguments to avoid acknowledgement of the fundamental injustice. Black descendants argued that crimes of this magnitude have no statute of limitations. They presented the oral histories their families had maintained as evidence of ongoing awareness and claim to justice. They demanded not just financial compensation, but public acknowledgement of what had happened. The case became a symbol of larger questions about reparations, historical justice, and how societies reckon with the crimes of slavery. National media coverage brought renewed attention to the ways enslavement had created not just economic exploitation, but intimate, personal horrors that standard historical narratives often sanitized or ignored. Dr. Rebecca Thornton, the historian who first examined the documents, became a leading voice in the broader historical reckoning. This case illustrates what we often avoid discussing about slavery, she said in numerous interviews. It wasn't just about labor exploitation. It was about absolute power used to violate people in the most intimate ways imaginable, and the effects of that violation echo through generations. Universities began studying the Whitmore case as a teaching tool. Legal scholars analyzed the trust documents as examples of how power structures can use legal systems to legitimize evil. Psychology researchers examined the intergenerational trauma documented in interviews with descendants. The case also prompted renewed examination of county records throughout the South. Researchers began actively looking for similar sealed documents, suspecting that the Whitmore case might not be unique. They were correct. By 2023, similar cases had been discovered in Virginia, Georgia, and Mississippi. Different specifics, but the same basic pattern. White enslavers using legal systems and coercion to force enslaved people into arrangements that violated every moral norm, then using those same legal systems to hide the evidence. Each discovery prompted similar battles between descendants, similar media attention, similar legal and moral questions about how to address historical injustices that had been deliberately hidden. The Whitmore case specifically remained in legal limbo as of 2025. Courts in South Carolina were wrestling with questions that had no clear precedents. How do you compensate for this kind of violation? How do you acknowledge harm that occurred more than 160 years ago, but continues to affect living people? Some White Whitmore descendants eventually broke the family's silence, acknowledging what had happened and supporting recognition of their black cousins' claims. These individuals faced ostracism from other family members, but also found community with the black descendants seeking justice. "We share blood, whether my relatives want to acknowledge it or not," said Thomas Whitmore, a white descendant who testified in support of the black family's claims in 2022. "What my ancestor did was monstrous. The least we can do is stop perpetuating the lies he created to hide it." Historical societies and museums began developing exhibits about the case, using it to educate visitors about the hidden dimensions of slavery's cruelty. The original photograph of Martha and Samuel became an iconic image, reproduced in textbooks and documentaries, a visual reminder of human beings trapped in circumstances beyond their control. But perhaps the most significant development was how the case empowered other families and communities to share their own hidden histories. Oral traditions about similar abuses, long dismissed as rumor or exaggeration, were taken more seriously. Archives that had been sealed or ignored were reopened. The truth was emerging, slowly and painfully, 160 years after the fact. Chapter 9. Memory, Justice, and the Unfinished Work. On a humid afternoon in June 2024, nearly 170 years after that photograph was taken in 1855, descendants of both Martha Whitmore and Samuel gathered on the grounds of what had once been the Whitmore plantation. The main house was long gone, destroyed by fire in 1923. The fields that had grown cotton through the labor of enslaved people were now part of a state conservation area, but the land remembered, and the people gathered there certainly remembered. The occasion was the dedication of a memorial, funded through a compromise settlement between various Whitmore descendants. The black family had received financial compensation, though amounts far less than what the original trust documents had promised. The white family had issued a formal acknowledgement of what Colonel Edward Whitmore had done. The memorial itself was simple but powerful. 2 bronze statues, life-sized, one of Samuel, standing with the dignity that slavery tried to strip from him but never fully succeeded. One of Martha, seated as she had been in that photograph, her expression captured in all its complexity of pain and resignation. Between them, 4 smaller statues represented the children, not hiding them, not denying them, but acknowledging them as real people who deserved to be remembered. Catherine Whitmore Johnson, a great-great-granddaughter of Samuel and Martha's eldest child, spoke at the dedication. At 73 years old, she had spent decades researching her family history, fighting for recognition, preserving the story for future generations. For so long, my ancestors were described as shameful secrets, she said to the crowd of more than 200 people, both black and white Whitmore descendants, historians, community members, as if their very existence was something to hide. But they were human beings. They were violated, yes. They were born from circumstances none of them chose, yes. But they were real people who loved, who hoped, who survived against impossible odds. She paused, looking at the statues. My great-great-grandfather Samuel was a man who endured unimaginable violation, and somehow still found the strength to love his children. My great-great-grandmother Martha was a woman trapped by society, by her father, by her own body, who eventually found the courage to fight for justice even when it destroyed her socially. Their story is American history, not the history we like to tell, but the history that actually happened, and we honor them not by hiding them anymore, but by making sure everyone knows what they survived. Thomas Whitmore, the white descendant who had testified in support of the black family's claims, also spoke. My ancestor, Colonel Edward Whitmore, committed an evil act, he said simply. He used his power, his wealth, and a legal system that treated people as property to violate 2 human beings and to create children who would carry that trauma through generations. No amount of money, no memorial, can undo that, but acknowledgement is a start. The ceremony concluded with a reading of names. Every person who had been enslaved on the Whitmore property, whose name could be recovered from records. More than 300 names, read aloud slowly, honoring people whose humanity had been denied, but whose memory endured. As the sun set over the land that had witnessed so much suffering, the crowd dispersed slowly. Descendants who had never met before exchanged contact information, promising to share family stories and photographs. Historians discussed plans for further research. Local schools arranged field trips to bring students to learn from the memorial. The work of justice was far from complete. Legal cases continued. Debates raged about reparations and how to address historical wrongs. But something had shifted. The silence had been broken. Subscribe to the channel to learn more forbidden and forgotten stories. Thank you for following the case of the Whitmore plantation. See you in the next video.